Welcome to The Explainer. So let's just dive right in, shall we? Today we're unpacking a really fierce, ongoing ideological debate that's playing out right now within Marxist-Leninist circles. The focal point? Cuba's recent, highly controversial market reforms. We're going to look closely at what these reforms actually are, why they're happening, and how different factions within socialist political theory are interpreting them. We're strictly relying on the arguments presented in our source material here, just to help you wrap your head around exactly what's at stake.
But before we get into the nitty-gritty details, I want you to hold on to this one central question. Can capitalist reforms actually save a socialist state? This single question sits right at the very heart of the conflict we're analyzing today. It's literally the ideological fault line that divides the defense of these new policies from their absolute harshest critiques. To make sense of this dense geopolitical and theoretical clash, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with Cuba's severe economic crisis, then move on to the sweeping new market reforms. After that, we'll weigh the socialist adaptation defense against the capitalist retreat critique. And finally, we'll wrap up by clarifying the Marxist economic theory underpinning all of this.
All right, Section 1, Cuba's severe economic crisis.
The undeniable material reality driving these massive shifts is that the island is facing immense hardship. Nobody in this debate is denying that fact. Just to give you a sense of the sheer scale here, the fuel shortage is incredibly severe. To put that in perspective, a Russian tanker delivered roughly 730,000 barrels of oil in March of 2026. But the crisis is so deep, so intense, that this massive supply was totally exhausted by the end of April. We're talking about real, tangible shortages happening on the ground, which is exactly what's pushing the government to take action.
Now, geopolitically speaking, the critic in our source material compares today's crisis with Cuba's infamous 1990s special period. But they point out a major difference. The critic argues that right now, Cuba actually has powerful international partners in a multipolar world. Think China, Russia, Vietnam. That's a world away from the abrupt total isolation they faced over 30 years ago when the Soviet Union collapsed, even though, yes, they are currently dealing with severe U.S. secondary sanctions. And just to underscore how absolutely catastrophic that 1990s rupture was, the author notes that between 1989 and 1993, the Cuban GDP plummeted by a staggering 33%. Alongside that, a 75% drop in imports. It was massive. The critic uses this specific data to argue that, hey, if Cuba survived that apocalyptic scenario without resorting to sweeping privatization, then today's crisis shouldn't automatically justify the current market reforms.
Which brings us to Section 2, sweeping new market reforms.
Reuters actually described this as the largest movement toward a market economy since the revolution. These measures introduce sweeping liberalizing mechanisms across the board. We're seeing fundamentally altered banking rules, surface rights for foreign investment extended for nearly a century, up to 99 years. And private firms are now allowed to scale up, employing over 100 workers and engaging directly in foreign trade. Make no mistake, these are not minor administrative tweaks. It's a massive shift.
Here's the real kicker. Previously, foreign investors were strictly required to work through a state-owned partner, which basically gave the state insight and control over everything. Crucially, these new reforms abolish that mandatory interface. This completely opens the door for foreign capital to form direct alliances with Cuban private owners, entirely bypassing the state apparatus. A real game changer.
Okay, moving on to Section 3, the socialist adaptation defense.
So how is this being defended? Defenders of the policy, like author Carlos Martinez, frame the entire situation through the lens of pure survival. They argue that Cuba is enduring the most comprehensive economic siege in modern history. Because of this intense, crushing blockade, they argue these reforms are just an unavoidable, temporary adaptation, necessary to keep the country afloat. And they insist that because the Communist Party firmly retains political command, the socialist nature of the state is totally preserved.
This creates a really stark ideological divide. On one side, you have the defense viewing this as a socialist adaptation, basically a necessary controlled tactic, kind of like Lenin's new economic policy, as long as the party is holding the reins. But on the flip side, the critic in our source material flat out calls this a capitalist retreat. Their argument is that expanding capitalist relations inherently undermines socialist ownership. To them, a business license carrying a red stamp doesn't magically transform capitalist ownership into socialism.
And that leads us perfectly into Section 4, the capitalist retreat critique. The critic comes in hot here, warning that prioritizing foreign banking and dollarized markets creates what economists call an enclave economy, What does that mean? Well, it's a scenario where investment exclusively chases private purchasing power, things like luxury property or import businesses. Meanwhile, it completely ignores essential but less profitable social needs like fixing the deteriorating electricity grid or funding public transport. Essentially, the economy fractures right in two. The author actually goes so far as to label the defender of these reforms as a Dengist. Now, that is a highly specific accusation in Marxist circles. They're basically claiming the defender is pushing the exact same ideology used to justify sweeping capitalist reforms in China under Deng Xiaoping, rather than offering a serious communist analysis of the dangers posed by private capital.
Ultimately, the critic hammers home a few major points. They argue that banking, it's not just an ordinary business. Surrendering it to private capital inevitably transfers massive economic power. Furthermore, removing those state partners aligns a brand new domestic capitalist class right alongside international capital. And, powerfully, they argue that while pressure from a blockade certainly explains why a retreat is happening, it absolutely does not magically make that retreat a socialist victory.
Let's zoom out a bit for Section 5, Clarifying Marxist Economic Theory.
To truly understand this debate, the source author steps back to correct a major theoretical misconception. A lot of people out there think profit and surplus entirely disappear under socialism. But pointing directly back to Marxist theory, the author notes that an enterprise surplus still absolutely has to exist to maintain civilization. The fundamental difference? It lies strictly in who controls and appropriates it. Is it privately hoarded or is it socially planned?
Drawing directed from Marx's critique of the Gotha program, the source uses this brilliant sequence to outline the necessary social deductions that have to be made from an economy's total product. Think about it. Before a simple worker can receive their individual share for consumption, society has to fund these 6 things. Everything from replacing worn-out machinery to supporting schools, healthcare, and those unable to work. A surplus is 100% required. The whole debate we're seeing is simply over whether private banks or a central plan should manage that surplus.
The source also takes time to clarify another heavily misunderstood concept, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. It points out that capitalism isn't continually becoming weaker day by day just because the rate of profit tends to fall. Actually, it's quite the opposite. Capital can become far more concentrated, technologically advanced, and powerful over long periods, even as absolute mass profits continue to rise.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final, really thought-provoking question. Does adapting to survive under an intense economic siege inevitably alter the class character of a system? Or can political power safely harness the immense forces of private capital without being consumed by them? It's a volatile intersection of economic survival and political ideology, and frankly, it's the question that will define Cuba's future. Thank you so much for joining me. Keep questioning and keep learning.